Hi. In this module, we're going to see how we can leverage data from third-party REST APIs in SharePoint Framework components. We're going to look at a couple different ways we can do this. And then we're going to look at first what is involved in consuming REST APIs in the SharePoint Framework. We're going to see how we can first do that in this first section when these APIs do not live in SharePoint and they're anonymous. So like say a third-party REST API by some third party. We're going to look at that first. In the second section, we're going to see how we can leverage the Azure AD client in calling services that are secured with Azure AD and understand how that works. And in the third section, we'll take a look at how we can call the Microsoft Graph, which is a secured service in Azure by Azure AD and is available inside my tenant. But we're also going to use it to see how we can use the Graph Client from the Graph team to make our lives a little bit easier. But first, we're going to start with calling REST APIs with the SharePoint Framework anonymously. Now, a common requirement that we have in a SharePoint Framework component or project is to display or interact with data external to the web part. This could be data in a SharePoint list and library, or data that's accessible via the Microsoft Graph, or that's accessible via external third-party APIs that are either anonymous or secured. Now, the SharePoint Framework provides APIs for all these different situations when you need to work with data and data sources external to the web part. We have really 4 different scenarios here. I've got 3 listed, but it's really 4 different scenarios. You've got the HTTP client, which is great for calling third-party REST APIs. And that's going to cover things like if you have a third-party API that lives, that is either anonymous or is secured. So that's going to be great for those situations. The second option that we have is, that I don't have listed here, but we cover in another module, in the SharePoint content module, is the SP HTTP client. And that's going to be derived from the HTTP client, but he's going to have some additional logic in him and a little wrapper to him that understands how to call the SharePoint REST API and making our life a little bit easier so that we don't have to worry about calling things like the handling things like changing from OData v3 to v4 and what kind of metadata we want to get back. But what if we want to call a web service that happens to be secured with Azure AD? Well, we have this additional client called the AAD HTTP client. And this is great because this is going to be able to leverage some existing infrastructure that Microsoft has provided in SharePoint Online that's going to make it easier for us to call these services that are secured with Azure AD. We're going to look at that in the second section of this module. And then the third option that we have there, I have it listed as the second, is the MSGraphclient. And this is going to be great for calling the Microsoft Graph REST API. Now, it's using the same infrastructure to get the token that we need to call the graph that the AAD HTTP client is requesting. But as you'll see when we get to the third section of this module, you're going to use a different style of accessing or making those calls. And we're going to be using an SDK that is provided by the Microsoft Graph team for JavaScript or client-side implementations. Now, most of these different scenarios require no extra clients or libraries. We have everything that we need. Now, we're going to first focus on calling third-party APIs that are anonymous with the HTTP client. Now, provided that this is provided to us on the current SharePoint context. And you can get to it by going to a SharePoint context and then saying .http client. And this is optimized for REST APIs, and it leverages the underlying fetch API, which is a standards-based way that most browsers have implemented on making HTTP requests. You can think of it as like the core jQuery.ajax method. It's a way for us to do HTTP requests in the browser. It's fully configurable. We can override any of the HTTP headers and the payload if we need to. Now, there are some browsers that have not implemented this, such as IE and Edge, but in those cases, we have a polyfill that is included for us by the SharePoint framework on all of our projects called the WhatWG fetch, and that's going to implement the fetch API for us. So we can just assume that it's going to be available for us. You're going to use this to call anonymous REST APIs, and you can even use it to call secured REST APIs. But if those APIs are secure with Azure AD, you're going to see in the next section, we've got some stuff that's going to make life a little bit easier. But let's say, for example, you were going to call some third-party web service that was secured using a token in the query string, or if they had a different style of authentication, or they were using an additional provider, OAuth provider, to obtain your tokens other than Azure AD. You could use any of those things. Now you're going to base the base HTTP API is what is used. This HTTP client is what's used by most of the other clients. The SharePoint client and the AAD HTTP client are both using this as their underlying infrastructure. So you want to call an anonymous REST API. How are you going to do it? It's really straightforward. You're going to import the HTTP client and the client response objects from the SPFX package, and then you're going to issue a GET request. So you're going to say HTTP client.get, and there's 3 parameters that you can pass in. 2 are required, 1 is optional. The first one is the endpoint that you want to go query, and the second one is a list of configurations. And by default, the configurations are pretty basic. That's the only option that you can specify in there. You can always create your own configuration and pass it in. But for the most part, that configuration is what you're looking to use. The third option is if you need to override any headers, or if you want to set the body, things like that. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to get back a client response, and that response is going to give you access to the HTTP headers in the response object. You may have, if there's any data that comes back in your response, which is going to be the case most of the time, if there's any data that comes back in the response, you're going to want to use the JSON method to parse the byte array of the response as a JSON object and use that in your response. When you get that response, then you can do whatever you want with it, as you can see there at the very bottom. So let's take a look at a demo on how we can call an anonymous third-party REST API. We're going to call an open service that supports CORS, which is going to allow us to do requests across domains. You do have to pay attention to CORS requirements by the service that you're calling, because if the service doesn't support CORS, then you can't make cross-domain calls across that service. So that's just something you're going to want to pay attention to. But let's dive in and let's look at a service that does support CORS. In this section, we're going to look at a demo on how we can use the HTTP client that is part of the SharePoint REST API, or the SharePoint SPFX API, that we can use in order to call an external third-party REST endpoint that is not authenticated, that is an anonymous endpoint. So here I'm calling a NASA public imagery web service, and I'm going to show an image, or the first image that comes back when I do a search for Apollo 4. And so you can just see some information here that I'm writing out. So let's look at the code for this. So when I look at the code for this, if I go down into the web parts, this is a React control. So all I'm doing here is I'm passing in a Apollo mission to this React control, and this React control is going to end up rendering it out by showing the image. It's going to show the title of the image, some keywords as well. We're not really interested so much in the React piece to this. We're more interested in how we're actually using this HTTP client object right here. So in this case here, you can see I'm referencing the HTTP client and the HTTP client response from the SP HTTP client. And so if I scroll down here, you'll see that in my render method, I'm going to check to see, has this web part already been rendered one time? And if it has, then I'm not going to re-render it. I'm not going to rewrite this stuff out. Instead, I'm just going to skip it. But if it has not been rendered one time, then I am going to go through and render it. And so what I have to do is call this function that gets an Apollo mission. It's going to get back a promise, and then it's going to run the then part of it is going to add the React component to the page. So let's take a look and see how we're actually getting this data. This is really straightforward. I'm going to use the current context of the current SharePoint page, and I'm going to say this.context.httpclient.get, and I'm going to pass in 2 parameters. The first one is going to be the URL of the endpoint that I want to go to. And so in this case here, if I take this endpoint, and if I just try and go to this endpoint in the browser, you'll see I'm just getting this big JSON object back. It's a gigantic JSON object with a bunch of information in it. But once I do that, I'm also going to pass over the configuration. Now, there's a third parameter I could use to pass over any additional header information that I want to set, like header values for the current, like for any authentication headers that I would need if I was going to a custom service that I managed, stuff like that. When I get the response back, the response is just going to come back to me as just a standard object. It's not going to, if a response is in JSON, I need to parse that data as JSON. That's part of the fetch API. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call response.json, which is going to parse the response out as a JSON object and return that back to me. So here I've got that JSON response that's being returned. So here I can see the JSON response. That is the actual object coming back from the NASA imagery web service. And if I scroll up and look here, you can see that here's that response that's being returned back. So I can see a response. And looking at the data that I got back, I saw that there was a collection object which had a single thing that was in it, and inside of that we had an items collection that was an array, and there were multiple items that came back. I just went through and said, let's just focus on the first one that comes back. So you can see here's the image that's coming back. So I can actually click on that and show that. There's the image we got, and the title of the image, as well as any pictures that came back, and I could even have a description with it as well. And you can see here in the code that I said go to the collection object and the items collection and get the first one. And then I already showed you the React component showing us how we're rendering that out. So this is a great way for you to go get data from a third-party web service that is not authenticated, that is an anonymous web service. So a great way for you to go through and to get some information that way and integrate it into a SharePoint Framework custom web part. Okay, in this section, we're going to talk about calling third-party REST APIs, but we're going to focus on those that are secured with Azure AD. And this is going to get fairly complicated because it's very involved. Some really cool infrastructure that Microsoft has included in SharePoint Online that we can take advantage of. So we're going to look at Azure AD, and how we have protected resources and how they work, and then how the SharePoint framework is going to allow us to call those. We're going to understand what permission requests are, and then look at how we can take advantage of all of this using the API AAD HTTP client that we get in the SharePoint framework. Now, resources in Azure can be easily secured with Azure AD. You can easily go through with like an Azure function, and you can basically just check a box that's going to say, I want to use Azure AD to secure this. You could always secure services that are not hosted in Azure with Azure AD. It's just that if it's hosted within Azure, it's just a heck of a lot easier. Now, this is going to require the request to that endpoint when you enable this to include a valid OAuth access token in the HTTP header of that request. It's going to have an authorization header. And this is how a lot of existing services already are secured, like the SharePoint REST API, the Graph API, and the Azure Management REST API, just to name a handful. So this is where I said that securing an Azure function is really simple. You're going to go into the Azure function application, go into the platform features, you select the authentication and authorization element from the networking tab, and then you can just turn it on by just flipping a switch and saying I want to go from off to on, and that's going to go through and set up our app service authentication. Now, when you want to call secured Azure AD Secured Resources from the SharePoint framework, there's a couple. Let me explain how this is going to work. And we're going to look at a diagram of this in just a minute. So the way that this works is that, first of all, you need to understand that when you make a request to a secured service from the client, there's some limitations on what you can and can't do. So I can't include the OAuth token inside of the code base for my web part, because that OAuth token is not tied to my application. It's just or tied to that use of that application. Once I have an OAuth token, it's like currency. It's like cash. I can use it for anything that will accept that cash, right? It doesn't matter how I got it. That's the big thing, is it doesn't matter how you obtained it. Another thing too, is that that token's only good for a certain amount of time. So once it expires, it's no longer valid. So that's one aspect to it. So I need to somehow get that token. Well, I can't include a username and password or an application's ID and secret. I can't include that in the web part because then it's no longer secure, because once I provide that, then anybody could use it. So the way that Microsoft did this, the only way to really secure this stuff is to do a server-side based authentication acquisition of that token. And so the way that this is done is that the SharePoint team has created a special, or it's not a special, it's just actually a regular Azure AD app, but they've created an Azure AD application that we're going to grant permissions to access a specific resource with a specific permission or permissions. So the way that it's going to work then is that my client-side component is going to call a SharePoint REST API. It's going to request from the SharePoint API that I need an access token to call this secured endpoint. And what that's going to do on the server side is that's going to trigger SharePoint to go to Azure AD and say, here's the app ID and secret for this special Azure AD application called the SharePoint Online Client Extensibility Web Application Principal. It's a really big name. I need to get an access token for this Azure AD app to make a call to this protected resource. And what Azure AD will do is it will say, I can see that that app, the SharePoint Online Client Extensibility Web App Principal, has been granted by your tenant administrator these permissions to that resource. So I'll create a token for those scopes or permissions for that resource and give it back to you. And then SharePoint will give that back to the SharePoint framework, and I can then use that access token inside of my SharePoint framework component to call those different endpoints. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here. There is no way to tell who requested or what application requested those that access token. So there's no way to tell that web part A requested it and web part B did not. So whenever you do this, what's going to happen is that once this permission has been granted, any application, any component, any client-side component can request this access token inside of can request an access token using this mechanism. So it's not tied to your application. Okay, that's very important to keep in mind. It's not tied to your application. These are two independent things. You've got the permission grant and you've got the application code, and they both rely, or the application code relies on that grant was already implemented. So the way that this is going to work, the way that this will work is that you will have to grant the permission. When you deploy the application, you then are going to have to, or the SharePoint Framework component, you're going to have to grant that permission to the tenant. You're not granting it to the app. And then that grant is valid until it's revoked. So if you uninstall the application, the permission is still there and you can still use it. The grant is not directly linked to the solution. So solution installation is not linked to the permission grant, approval, or rejection. What that means is you should probably in your code assume that the grant has not been approved. So you want to have some error trapping code in there that's going to handle when you get an error that comes back. So this special app must be granted these permissions. How are you going to grant those permissions? These permissions are going to be defined within a solution manifest file. So there's three different ways. You can do it through the solution manifest file, so you can do it declaratively. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. The other option is to do it using PowerShell or using the Office 365 CLI. So you can see all these different options available on this link that you see there on the page. So if you want to do it declaratively, the way you do that is that you go into the package solution.json file, and you're going to add in a new section called the Web API Permission Requests. And that's going to have a collection of objects. Each object has a resource. So where do you want to post this? And a scope. And the scope is going to define where the data is going to end up going. We're going to define like what the permission that you're granting that's being granted. So when you package up your solution, you deploy it, you're going to get prompted for that request. So before we do that, let's understand how this whole thing works. So at the bottom here, you can see here's my tenant administrator. And what he's going to do ahead of time is he's going to deploy the solution to the tenant app catalog, step 1 or step 2. They don't have to be done in any particular order. But what this chart is showing is that what he has done is he has gone into my tenant, and he has granted that SharePoint Online Client Azure AD app a specific permission on this resource, and that was defined inside that either using the package.json manifest file, or it was defined using PowerShell or the Office 365 CLI. Then my web part, when it wants to go call that web API, it is first going to use the SharePoint Framework API to go to the server to say, I need to get an access token from Azure AD for this app with this permission to that resource. And Azure AD will validate that that has actually been granted, and when it has, it will return back an access token that is then used to call that API. So what's the code look like for this? Well, you're going to use the AAD HTTP client, and everything really boils down to these first 2 lines here. So the client factory, what the client factory is going to do is that is going to create an instance of a Azure AD client that you see down here that is going to be configured to call that endpoint. You're going to call get client and pass in one of 2 values, either the name of the resource, or you're going to pass in the URI of that resource. Either one of those things is going to work here because the URI is the unique, like the unique ID of the thing that you're trying to talk to. So maybe it's graph.microsoft.com, or it's the SharePoint REST API, or it's some other third-party API that we're working with. That's going to do that get client is what's going to trigger all the stuff you saw on the previous slide and give you back that Azure AD client in the then statement there. And so then a little bit farther down, you can see where I'm issuing a GET request to that endpoint. I jumped ahead of myself. To that endpoint with this configuration. And I have, again, just like the other options you've seen, I could pass in that third option, which is a request object. What's special about this, though, is that AAD client has already been configured with the HTTP header authorization equals bearer with the access token. So that's how the authentication is going to be handled for us. All right. Now, when the administrator deploys the SharePoint Framework component to the tenant app catalog, he or she is going to get this extra little message at the bottom if that component has the declarative permission included in it that says you need to go to a special page in the tenant admin, by the tenant administrators to go to a special page to enable this or disable this. All right. So while the application can be installed in the sites, it doesn't mean the permission has been granted. They're going to have to go to this special page called API Management in the SharePoint Online Admin Center, and they're going to select the permission and then say, I approve it. And once that's done, then they can go through and get the data. Now, I'm going to show you a demo of this, of doing this with the Microsoft Graph. And while in the third section, we're going to see how it's even easier using the API that Microsoft gives us for the Microsoft Graph, I wanted to show it to you first with the Azure AD client, because I'm going to show you the manual way on how we're doing the authentication, and it's going to help us avoid having to deal with creating a custom service and securing it. We can just use an existing service that's already been deployed and secured. So let's take a look at that. Now in this second demo, we're going to use the Azure AD HTTP client to talk to a Azure AD Secured Web Service. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need a secured web service to talk to. And one of the easiest ones that we can find is the Microsoft Graph. We're going to see in the next demo how we can talk to the Microsoft Graph in a little bit easier way. But I'd like to show it calling the Microsoft Graph with the Azure AD client, because you can see exactly what is required here and how the Graph client is going to make things a little bit easier as well. But 2 different ways to talk to the exact same service. So let's first start by coming over here and taking a look at the code for my project. So I have a web part, and what this web part is going to do is it's going to show some information from the Microsoft Graph. So I'm going to have some user items that are going to come back, and we're going to write those out to a React-based component. So if I look at this component here, it's going to write out a list of some people. So you can see I'm looking at all the user items that come back. For each user, I'm going to write out the ID, the email, and the display name of those people. So if I come over here and look at the web part itself, I'm first going to, using the same pattern that we used in the last demo, I'm going to check to see, has this been rendered? And if it has not, then I'm going to call get users and then write those users out. And you can see that's the results that we're getting back here of these iUser items. So let's see what this function does. So what this function is going to do is I'm first going to say this.context, and I'm going to use the AAD HTTPClient factory to say go create an instance of this Azure AD client. Now, I'm going to tell it that I need an HTTP client or an Azure AD client for a specific resource. And I can use this by name, or I can use the URL of the endpoint. I prefer to use the URL in this case here. So I'm saying go to the Microsoft Graph. Now, under the covers, behind the scenes, what's going to happen is that the Microsoft Graph or the Azure AD client is going to call back to SharePoint on the server side and say that this tenant needs an access token to call the Microsoft Graph. And so as I explained in the slides, what that's going to do is that's going to trigger the SharePoint API server side. We don't see this happening. But what's going to happen server side is that it's going to go to Azure AD and it's going to request an access token on behalf of me, the current user that's logged in, for the Azure AD application that was created by SharePoint for my specific tenant. And it says I need a token using this user ID and or this logged in user and this Azure AD app. I need a token for the Microsoft Graph and using this endpoint. And what Azure AD is going to do is it's going to check to see, has that application already been granted access to the Microsoft Graph? And if it has, it will turn around and give me back an access token that is good for all of the permissions, otherwise known as scopes, that were granted to it. Okay. Once that happens, the SharePoint framework is then going to go return back to me an Azure AD client that then I can use to call Azure AD or a service that's been secured with Azure AD. And so what I'll do is I'll say, create an endpoint that's going to call the Microsoft Graph v1 endpoint, the user's endpoint, and say, give me the first 10 users and just give me their ID, their display name, and their mail address. And then here I'll say, go use that client to issue an HTTP GET. And then it's going to say to this endpoint with this configuration that's been set up. And the nice thing is that the Azure AD client is going to automatically include the token in the authorization header and the HTTP authorization header so that I don't have to go deal with adding that additional information. I'm going to get a response back. Just like the other HTTP clients, I'm going to parse out the JSON and then hand that back to the caller, which is under get users. That's the part of my calling get users. That's the part right here that's going to use that to add those to my React component. Now, how do we play with this? How do we actually use this? Well, I can't just run this with like a gulp serve and see this run, because I have to deploy this to trigger the the permission request to happen. Now, I talked about in the slides how you can define this either using PowerShell or using the Office 365 CLI. And in my project, what I did is I created a web API permission for the Microsoft Graph for the scope of user.readbasic.all. So I went ahead and saved a little bit of time. I went in and I already ran gulp build, gulp bundle with the ship flag and gulp package solution with the ship flag. And what that gave me is inside of the SharePoint folder, I have this SharePoint package. So let's go over to the browser and let's deploy this. So if I go to my app catalog for my site, let's go ahead and upload this. And I will find that in my list of downloads here. Here we go. So I will upload this. And what we're going to see is it's going to prompt me to say deploy, but also notice that it says, please go to the service principal permissions management page, because I'm going to have to approve the permission of the Microsoft Graph of user.readbasic.all. So I'll say, go ahead and deploy it. And so it'll get deployed. I'll just scroll over here and make sure there are no errors. Everything's been deployed. So we're in good shape. And now let's come over here to our admin site for our SharePoint Online tenant. So I have to go to the API page, which is in the new admin center. So I'll go to try it now. And then down here under API management, I'll select this, and we should see a new tenant-wide request here for a pending approval. So I will select this for Microsoft Graph, and then I'll say approve or reject. And so it's telling me that this just happened. I made the request, and it's saying that when I do this, it's going to apply to every single client-side solution in my tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and say approve. So there we go. It's been approved. So now we're in good shape. We can actually use this. So let's now come over to my SharePoint site, and I need to go to a page where I can actually play with this. So let's go to SharePoint. Let's go to SharePoint here, SPFX site. I'm going to go to the site contents page or list, and we're going to create a new app. So I have to use my real site here. So we'll scroll down and we'll use this, the one that we just installed or deployed. And so now we're installing it. And so while this is installing, so you can see it's installing here, let's go over to the site pages and let's create a new page that we can test this on. So we'll create a new page. And we will come down here and let's see if our web part's already been created. So we'll go with this, and I'll just open this up in the big mode, scroll down, and there it is. So we'll go ahead and add it. And sure enough, we can see that we're getting some data coming back. So the data is coming back because we only have one user in this tenant. This is just a test tenant that I use. But we can see that we're actually getting back users from calling the Microsoft Graph endpoint using the Azure AD HTTP client. So we can see that this is working just fine. I can even go through and we'll publish this. Name can't be blank, got to give it a name. So we'll just call this page our test page. There we go. And so there it is. There's our page that's actually running. And you can see that we're actually calling the Azure AD client. If I go to the network tab over to XHR, and if I do a refresh here on this page and do a filter for graph, there we go. You can see our request. So we did the first request here. This is our pre-flight for cores, so for the options tag. And then here's the real one here for the get. And so there's our request, and the data that came back, we can see is just a single person that came back. But what's nice about this too is if I go look at this, I can see the authorization header. So I could take this entire string right here. If I copy this entire string, so we'll copy this, and if I go to a site called jwt.io, and if I scroll down a little bit, I can paste that in right here, and I can see that this access token is for the Microsoft Graph. It was issued for my tenant, my test tenant right here. This is it's not valid before this address. It's not valid after this address. It expires on, or timestamp. It expires at this time. The app name. This is the Azure AD app name of that special app that SharePoint created for my tenant. It's called the SharePoint Online Client Extensibility Web Application Principal with this ID. And every single tenant's going to have the exact same one. There's the person that made the request. There's his name. There's my object ID. And then if I scroll down a little bit farther, I have the scope or the permissions that I can use with this. And there's my UPN or my unique name here, my full-blown name to this. And so you can see that if I was calling a web service that I had created, I can not only check to see that it came from my tenant, so there's my tenant ID right there, but I can also check to see the user ID that's making the request. So this part I couldn't spoof or anything like that. It would be coming from the user that made the request. And so that's how we can work with Azure AD, the Azure AD HTTP client, and calling a secured Azure AD based web service. Now in this last section, we're going to talk about using the Microsoft Graph, or calling the Microsoft Graph, which is another third-party REST API. But this one, and it's also secure with Azure AD, but this one we have a couple extra little tools here that are going to make our life a little bit easier than having to go through the Azure AD authenticated story like we did in the last demo and section. So I'm going to do a quick overview of what the Microsoft Graph is, talk about the JavaScript API, the TypeScript declarations, and then understanding the SharePoint API wrapper that Microsoft has given us. So what is the Microsoft 365 platform? Well, it just encompasses a lot of different things. You can extend the things that we have out of the box in Microsoft 365 and Office 365, things like documents and conversations and pages. And you can also build your own experiences and applications. And all of that, the way you're going to get to all of that data is using the Microsoft Graph, which is think of it as like a proxy-based API. Now, Office 365 has a lot of different sources of data and different data repositories and things like users and groups and organizations and Outlook and SharePoint and OneDrive. You've got things from Windows 10. You've got things from enterprise mobility and security. All of these different things are these different places have data, and they have different REST APIs where you can access that data. One of the nice things about the Microsoft Graph is it's acting like a proxy endpoint to all of these different sources. And so we only need to get one OAuth token to authenticate and go to one endpoint to be able to get access to all of this data that is provided that we have been given access to the underlying data and data sources. Now, it's a single resource, as I said, that's going to proxy multiple Microsoft services and allows for easy traversal of different objects and relationships. Now, what I mean by that is that I can find someone inside the Microsoft Graph using the Microsoft Graph REST API. And then from that entity, from that individual's entity, I can say, show me their direct reports. And so I could see that someone named Mary works for that one individual. Let's say that individual we started with, his name was John. So I can see that Mary works for John, and then I can look at the files that Mary has worked on and shared and using the Graph REST API. And then once I find one of those documents, I could then see other people who have collaborated on it, and it may have also been John. So I get this circular reference back to John. That what's just kind of cool about it is just being a graph. There's no like clear path of how you want to follow through it. It's just a whole network of all these different people that you can get to. This is also, the Microsoft Graph is also simplifying token acquisition and management. And it's doing it in the way that it's keeping us from having to connect to various endpoints and obtain an access token for each one of those endpoints. Way back before Microsoft Graph, we had to talk to, say, a SharePoint REST API, and then a OneDrive API, and a Contacts API, and a Mail API. Now, we just have to go to one endpoint to get to all of that stuff. It also eliminates the need for a traditional discovery service. And so in the past, as I was explaining a moment ago, we also had the concept of where we would have to go to different endpoints, but we didn't know what the endpoint was. So like, for example, the OneDrive endpoint for me as an individual could have been different for a different user. And it was the way the domain was set up. And so I didn't know what these things were. So I went to one well-known discovery endpoint that would give me access and give me a list of kind of like being almost like a phone book or yellow pages to all of the other resources that I have access to. Now the Microsoft Graph has, it's not just a REST API, but they've created multiple multiple SDKs for different platforms that we can take advantage of. But they've also built, one of these SDKs is a JavaScript SDK. What this is going to require us to do is it requires you to initialize it first with the Azure AD Provided OAuth 2 access token in order to then use that client to be able to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So this is a snippet of the JavaScript SDK for the Microsoft Graph. You see here that I am calling the init method on this and passing in an object that is an auth provider for it. and that is going to give me back a access token. So I would set up an auth provider, and I'd have to go handle the authentication with Azure AD to obtain the access token. And then once that's done, you can see down at the bottom where I'm calling client.api/me, and that's how I'm getting access to my information inside the Microsoft Graph. In addition, they've also created a TypeScript type declarations for those of us who are working with TypeScript to make it easier for us to work with the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK in a TypeScript experience. And you might start to see where all of this is going because we're in the SharePoint framework and we're using TypeScript. So let's just say I wanted to use these type declarations. Well, the benefit here is that I can reference them by importing that project into my project, or import those types into my project. And you'll notice here that in the response that I get back to going to me, I'm getting a user object back, and I can type that as a specific kind of object. So as you see a little bit farther down in those console.log statements, I'm able to say user.displayname, display mail name, and also show my business phone. So I'm able to see all this information about these users. Now, when it comes to the SharePoint framework, what Microsoft has done is they said, instead of them creating an API for the Microsoft Graph, what they did is they're leveraging the JavaScript API or SDK that the Graph team has created. And they said, well, we already have this Azure AD way of obtaining an access token. Why don't we create a wrapper for you that is going to handle the initialization of that Microsoft Graph Client, the JavaScript SDK, so we can get the token for you because you're a well-known endpoint. We know that you're called Microsoft Graph. We know where the URL is to go talk to the Microsoft Graph. And we already know the Azure AD application that we have in SharePoint that we saw in the previous section that can be granted access to the Microsoft Graph. So why don't we just take advantage of all of that? And so what Microsoft has done, and then what they would do is they just give us access to the Graph Client JavaScript SDK that the Graph team has created. And that's what this is. They created this thing called the MSGraphclient factory off the current context. And now all I have to do is just call get client. Remember before when we did this with Azure AD in that factory, I had to specify what resource I wanted to talk to. Well, in this case, I don't have to do that because the client already knows what endpoint or what resource we're going to. It's the graph. So I call get client, and then it's going to give me back the Microsoft Graph Client that I can do any work that I want to from there. And that's where I could do like the client.api/me. I do have to also set up the permissions the same way that I would have to do with the Azure AD permissions for an Azure AD Secured Service, because the Graph is an Azure AD service, or it is an Azure AD Secured Service. So I can specify the resource, I can specify the scope, and here you can see the different permissions and stuff that have all been defined. You are still going to have to go through that exact same process of granting a permission to the Graph for your application. You could do that the exact same way that we did earlier as well, where I can specify the name or the permissions, and can do that either using a declarative approach, as you saw on the last slide, or I can use PowerShell or the Office 365 CLI. And you would then have to approve those permission requests the exact same way using the API page in the SharePoint admin portal. So after we saw a demo in the previous section where we were able to see how we were able to call an Azure AD Secured Service, and we called the Microsoft Graph, let's see how we can do the exact same thing, but this time we're going to see how we can do this without having to specify the resource name and instead get access to the Graph SDK. Now in this last demo, we're going to look and see how we can work with the Microsoft Graph, or the MS Graph HTTP client, the client that the SharePoint Framework team has provided to us in the SharePoint Framework API. And in the last demo, if you recall, we looked at the Azure AD HTTP client. We used that to authenticate and call the Microsoft Graph. But the Microsoft Graph there's two characteristics to it. First of all, it's a well-known endpoint. It's a well-known resource and web service that we can take advantage of. So it has a name that we all know. It has an ID that we all know. The other thing too is that the Microsoft Graph team has created a JavaScript API and a TypeScript declaration file, type declaration file that we can use to call the Microsoft Graph. So some of the things that we have to do with the Azure AD client, we don't have to do with the Graph client. So let's take a look at what I mean by this. So what I did is inside of package.json, what you'll see here is I've installed the Microsoft Graph TypeScript or type declarations here as the 1.5.0. Now, if I come over here to the web part, the web part is going to work very similar to how the other one worked just a minute ago. But what you're going to notice here is that getting the data for this is going to be a lot simpler. So it's written. This one's written a little bit different. And the way that this one's going to work is that I'm going to actually pass the entire Microsoft Graph client to my React-based component, my React component. So I'm going to say this.context.Microsoft Graph Client Factory. I'm going to call get client. Now the difference is remember with Azure AD, I had to specify the endpoint that I was going to go to, the Microsoft Graph. And I didn't have to do that in this case because in this case here, we already know that we're going to the Microsoft Graph. So this Graph Client Factory is going to be able to do all that stuff for me. And it's going to handle all of the authentication stuff and the token acquisition from Azure AD to talk to the Microsoft Graph because it already knows where it's going and all of that stuff. So then I'm giving my client back right here. You'll see I'm going to pass it into my React component. And then inside of my React component, all I'm doing here is I'm checking to see once the thing is initialized, I'm using the component to go to the Microsoft Graph me endpoint, and then I'm setting the state of the current component equal to my name, my email address, and my business phone. And then just for the heck of it, I'm also going to go in and I'm going to use this to get a reference to the Graph client and say, go get my picture, which is a blob type, and then I'm going to set the state of the image property on the state equal to the blob. So then down here in the rendering method, I'm using the Fabric React component, the persona component, to render myself out, showing my name and my email address and just some other information too. There's the image URL as well. So we can take a look, see how this one's going to work. Except one more thing that we have to look at is inside of package solution, I have to specify a permission that my component is going to be granted here. So you can see here that I've got the resource equal to Microsoft Graph, and the permission is the user.readbasic.all. So I still have to give my component still is going to have be granted permission to be able to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So I've already gone ahead and I've already built this. So you can see there's my package right here. So let's take a look at this guy that's working. So I'm going to come over here to the browser and I'm going to go ahead and upload this component. So I will select the Microsoft Graph. Let's jump over to demo 3. I'm going to go ahead and upload it. And when it goes to prompt, it's going to go ahead and install it. It's going to say you want to go through and deploy it, and it's going to tell it needs these permissions. So it's not checking to see that I've already granted it permissions from the previous demo. It sees these as two totally different things. So we can see everything's been deployed, so we're in good shape there. If I come back over here, notice that I still have this one permission that's been approved, but when I refresh the page, you'll notice there is now a second one that's pending approval. Now, I don't have to approve this because I already have this one that's approved here. And in fact, if I try to approve it a second time, you'll see you get this kind of a weird experience here about, hey, it's already approved. You can't. It's not telling me that it's already been approved. It just says that you've already granted that permission and that scope on this same thing. So even though you get this error, I mean, if I refresh the page here, you can leave it sitting here because I've already got this permission. It doesn't know that this permission goes with one SharePoint Framework component and this one goes with a different one. There is no differentiation on permissions with what you're doing. So now if I come back over here to the page and if I go to the site contents and go install this Graph Client app, So we'll scroll down a little bit. There's my Graph Client right here. And so what we'll do is we'll wait to see this guy get installed. And an easy way to do that is to switch over to Classic mode. And you can see here it's already been installed. So we're in good shape. So we'll go back from Classic, back to the modern experience. We'll go into the Pages library. And then let's go to our test page. And we're going to put this into edit mode. And we can see we still have our AAD HTTP client from before. I'm going to put this in edit mode. And I'm going to add in a new web part right above it. And this will be our graph persona component. And there we go. We can see now that this one is also showing us information from the Microsoft Graph. So we have two things now. We got pulling it using the Azure AD client, and we're doing it using the Graph client. So just two different ways to do the same thing, except what I'm really trying to show you here is that they're both calling an Azure AD Secured Endpoint. Just the Graph one, we don't have to provide it anywhere near as much information here in our demo. And the reason for that, again, is because the Graph client already knows where the graph is. It already knows what the endpoint is. It already knows the scopes and all the permissions and stuff that we're going to need here. And so that's how we can work with the Graph client for the SharePoint framework. So in this module, what we were able to see was how to call third-party REST APIs. We started off first by seeing how to do this with an anonymous service, using the HTTP client. And then we saw how we could do that calling a service that was secured with Azure AD and being able to use the Azure AD and HTTP client and the special Azure AD application that we would be granting permissions to inside of for SharePoint. And then after we saw that, we saw in this last section how we could call the Microsoft Graph. I've included a couple extra resources here that you could take a look at and reference throughout your applications or throughout your development to learn more about how to call these third-party services. So with that, hope you learned a lot about how to call third-party services, including custom and anonymous and secured services, including the Microsoft Graph, using Azure AD. So thank you very much, and I hope you pick up another one of our modules and say it again. So thank you very much.